Hi, I'm Elena, welcome or welcome back to my channel and welcome back to part 3 of the beginner's guide to feminist literature. Today I want to share some fiction recommendations with you. I have some contemporary fiction, historical fiction and classics, and I have a few fantasy sci-fi books, which I think is such an interesting genre within feminist literature. With the non-fiction, I really toned it down with not trying to overwhelm you. Haven't done that good of a job with fiction because everything was just staring at me. I am 100% sure that you will find something that you like. So I'm not going to make a very long intro. If you have not watched part 1 and 2 of this video, it is linked in the description down below, so do check those out first and then come back to this one. Let's start with contemporary fiction. These days so many wonderful people write contemporary feminist fiction. So I've picked the books that I personally really loved. One of my favorite books of last year was Writers and Lovers by Lily King. This is kind of romance novel meets literary fiction. We follow a woman who is a writer and she's trying to figure out her life. What I liked most about this book in a sense of feminist literature is that a lot of things in this book were very subtle commentaries on the way that men write women. Especially older men who always assume that younger women are very interested in them. And our protagonist gives a lot of commentary on that in the way that she behaves and experiences emotions. This is also just a really great fast-paced read. Another one that has gotten a lot of recognition, but if you've not heard of it, I would still highly recommend that you read it, and that is Girl, Woman, Other by Bernardine Evaristo. This has an ensemble cast of a lot of different characters who all have different experiences. All of the people in this book have unique experiences with sexuality, with love, with emotions, with being a woman, with being a person. And this is just so well written. It is a little bit of experimental writing. I can show you what the text looks like. Won the Booker Prize of 2019. Of Women and Salt by Gabriela Garcia is another book that has gotten a lot of recognition. All these characters are Latina women who either live in Latin America or they live in the US. We have different times. Part of this book is historical fiction as well. It is about immigration, it's about addiction, it is about finding home and finding family. My most recent 5-star is Elena Knows by Claudia Pinheiro. This was translated from the Spanish by Frances Riddle. I would describe this as a literary mystery. We have a main character, she has Parkinson's and her daughter has died. Everyone assumes that it's a suicide, but she thinks it's not because of certain reasons you will discover in the book. This is so interesting, and the main character is fascinating, absolutely fascinating. This was so well written. I was so impressed by it. I think with my contemporary books, I read a lot of hype books. I will admit that. These are all the hype books that are worth the hype. Another very hype book, but again, so worth it. This was one of my favorite books of last year again, and that is Kim Jiyoung, Born in 1982. This is a book about a woman's life in Korea. We start in her childhood and how she grows up and everything that she has to encounter as a woman. So it starts with her brother getting the first portion at dinner and her getting whatever is left over. Later we meet her at the office and how starting a family life and also working in an office, how there's so much prejudice and rules that you have to keep as a woman versus when you are a man. The ending of this book had a certain twist that I thought was so genius, so good and so layered. This is definitely one of those books that will enrage you, but it is so good. Definitely one of the books that is really for a beginner as well, because it really helps you understand all the feminist struggles. The last book in this category I want to discuss is actually a science fiction, so it's not really contemporary, but it's definitely not historical. And that is The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin. This book is the first in a trilogy. I will admit I've only read the first one so far. The sci-fi fantasy element is not necessarily what is most interesting from a feminist perspective, but I think the way that the story is structured and the way it is told, the way the characters are developed is very interesting from a feminist perspective. Right, we have arrived at the historical fiction. So let's start with some books that are about myth and that are about ancient times. This book I finished yesterday and it's no surprise that it's so wonderful, and that is Galatea. I still don't know how to say it, by Madeline Miller. This is a short story about a woman who is a statue and about the man who has created her as a statue. This is a myth that has always been told from a male perspective, but it's never been told from the perspective of the statue. And of course, Madeline Miller, who did such an amazing job in Circe as well, did an amazing job in this one. This is a short story that will help you get into the feminist perspective of myth, so definitely recommend this one. This I found a more difficult one to recommend because I do have some commentary on it from a feminist perspective, but it's still very interesting because it made me look different at the story of Troy, and that is The Silence of the Girls by Pep Barker. This is a retelling of the story of Troy from the perspective of one of the women that Achilles enslaves to be his lover. Overall, I found this so interesting because we get a lot of imagined tales of what it was like to be enslaved as a woman, which in all the other retellings, like I love Madeline Miller, but she does not do the best of job in The Song of Achilles writing the women, we'll be honest about that. I read this and then I read The Song of Achilles, and I think that may have been the reason why I didn't love The Song of Achilles, because I had just read about all the female perspectives, so I really did not like the male characters in this story. But my commentary on this book would be that we also get some male perspectives in this book, which kind of undoes the whole purpose of this story. It's still an interesting reading experience and it still gives you a fresh perspective on a story you may already know. The Wolf Den by Elodie Harper, I think I have talked about this book quite a lot. That is set in the time of Pompeii. This is set in a brothel and we follow all the women who work in this brothel, and of course it's very interesting from a feminist perspective because we read those stories where men go to a brothel and the women who work there are just a device to build the character of a certain man, but here we follow all the women in the brothel, which makes for a really good story. I think this is also part of a series. Haven't read anything else besides the first one, but I found the first one really good. The Adventures of China Aaron by Gabriela Gabson Camara is translated from the Spanish to English. This is a story about a young girl who has to marry very soon and has 2 sons, and eventually she decides that that is not the life she's going to live, and she goes on this journey where she meets a woman, a Scottish woman called Liz. This book is so interesting also from a queer perspective because she starts to develop a different relationship with her body, with her sexuality throughout the entire novel. This is set in 1872 and it's so interesting, I think, to read queer stories in a historical setting. I want to recommend another fantasy. This is a historical fantasy in a way that I think the setting feels historical, but it's not officially set in a certain period of time, as far as I know. And that is Dreamer's Pool by Juliette Marillier. We follow a woman who is a healer and who is not very interested in getting settled in a way that maybe women would in a historical setting. I don't want to say anything about the plot of this one. Magical woods, fairies, historical setting, great feminist plot lines, a lot of discussion on women's positions, a lot of discussion on victim blaming and rape as well, which I think in a lot of historical romance and historical fantasy, all those things are very explicit, and I really appreciated that Juliette Marillier didn't do that in this book at least, but it's still a discussion she found was very important to have. Another great historical romance is quite a recent one, and that is Reputation by Lex Croucher. This is really a fun historical romance that the tone kind of feels like a contemporary romance, but the language and the setting does really feel like a Regency era Bridgerton, but I think like better written, and it's not as explicit as Bridgerton. It does feel a little bit more like YA. This is about a girl who connects to a friendship group who is kind of out of her standards, out of her league. I forgot the Regency terms, but she connects to these friends and she really admires them, and within it she makes a lot of mistakes. Why I think this is a great feminist lit rag is because towards the end of the story she stands up for herself in a certain context that I feel like, again, same with this, is not very often well done in historical romance or fantasy, and Lex Croucher handled it so well. Alright, let's talk about classics. When I wanted to read feminist literature, classics was something I was really interested in. Simultaneously, these can be the hardest to find or require you maybe to work the hardest to find them. No need for you to stress anymore because I have a pal. One of my favorite books of all time is To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. Right off the bat, this book is not for everyone. Virginia Woolf's writing is very stream of consciousness and does not have a lot of plot. I had to reread this for them to really appreciate the feminist discussions in his book. We often talk about the emotional labor that women do, especially in a marriage. I didn't notice this until my reread how incredibly prevalent that discussion is, not only like the literal discussions that women have, and also men and women have. That emotional labor is also one of the main subjects between the marriage of Mr. and Mr. Ramsay, whose home is the central location in this plot, and we follow them, their visitors and their children. The marriage between Mr. and Mr. Ramsay is one of the most interesting marriages from a feminist perspective I have ever read from. If you think you will like stream of consciousness, then please read To the Lighthouse. My favorite feminist Victorian novel is The Tennant of Wildfell by Anne Bronte. I just reread this for the Brontëlong. As a novel, it is not as amazing as some of the other novels I will discuss. Looking at the time and the subjects discussed, it is amazing. We follow a woman called Helen and she is in an abusive marriage. I will not say much more, but the things that Helen does, the bravery that she shows in a Victorian setting is amazing. It's so interesting. The book is very layered, even though it is written in a very realistic, naturalistic way. So it doesn't swoon you the way that Jane Eyre would, but I think it's quite an accessible classic for Victorian literature, and I would highly recommend that you read it, especially if you want to read feminist classics. This one needs to be on your list. A short story that's also very famous, but rightfully so, is The Yellow Wallpaper by, I can never say his name, Charlotte Perkins Gilman. This is about a woman who struggles mentally. She starts to see things in the yellow wallpaper in the bedroom that she's in. Her husband is her doctor, and throughout the short story we wonder whether she's really ill or whether her husband is using some sort of control or power over her to put her in the situation that she's in. It has some early horror elements as well, so I would say this is like early feminist horror thriller kind of story, and it's weird, it's fascinating, it's worth a read. A book that I really appreciated for its experimental writing is The Color Purple by Alice Walker. This is about a family who lives in America. I'm not sure, it's historical fiction, but I think it's set in the 1930s. It is very feminist. It's about abusive men, about the way women respond to that and how it doesn't really matter how you respond. An abusive man is always an abusive man. It is queer, it is historical. What I like most is that part of the book is written as a diary from our main character who is not extremely literate. So the language really suits her inner voice, which I thought was so well done in this book. A translated classic I really enjoyed is Half Lifelong Romance by Eileen Chang. This is a incredibly big family drama. Within that family drama there's this romance that connects certain families. It's a Chinese drama, there's a lot going on, and our main character Manzan is really just fighting. She is fighting throughout this entire novel for her right to just exist with all that sexism brings to her life. This is quite an investment. It did quite a lot to my feelings and emotions, but it was one of the most interesting books I read last year. Kindred by Octavia E. Butler is historical sci-fi. Is that possible? It has a historical time travel element. I don't know how you would describe that. We meet a woman in the 70s. She's a black woman and she starts to accidentally time travel back to, I think, 18 something, and she ends on a plantation where she's assumed to be an enslaved woman. Looking at race, class, and of course looking at feminism and the way this main character tries to live in a world that is so incredibly violent towards her. Talking about sci-fi, I do have to mention The Handmaid's Tale. This is a sci-fi dystopian world where women are stripped of all of their rights. I didn't personally love this book, although it's been years since I read it. I should probably give it another go, but it's one of those feminist classics that everyone seems to talk about and a lot of people love. If you have not heard about this yet, and you really like dystopian novels, I personally don't love dystopian, so I think that's part of it. If you enjoy dystopian and want to read feminist literature, then The Handmaid's Tale needs to be given a go. A book that I think you really have to look a little bit more into the layers of the book to find the feminist tone, but that is The Age of Innocence by Edith Wharton. I removed the dust jacket because it was really ugly. The base of this story is a love triangle and a romance, and we follow a male perspective, which does not feel necessarily like a great feminist book, but one of these women does represent what was wrong in these times, because I think it is 1819 when we follow all of these characters, and she is very independent, she's very of her own mind, but it doesn't really work in the time that she lives in. Something Edith Wharton would do is gender swap within her books. This male perspective was kind of her perspective towards the man that she was married to and the man that she was in love with. So I really do like the tones within that book, and the woman that she writes in this book is very interesting as well. Oh, one of the most vile, violent and amazing feminist novels I've read is Sula by Toni Morrison. This is about the great group of women who are all vile towards each other, towards men, towards the world. But it's really interesting to look at why they are this vile and why not all of them are incredibly vile, but they're not likable characters. It's Toni Morrison, so you know it's gonna be good. From a feminist perspective, maybe Beloved will always be the #1, but from all other novels by Toni Morrison, this might be the one that I found most interesting from a feminist perspective, because you are really hating these women, most of them at least, but also trying to get into their minds, which I think is a great challenge when you're reading feminist lit. And then the last classic I want to recommend is a book that you can have a lot of interesting feminist discussions about. That is My Cousin Rachel by Daphne du Maurier. This book discusses like the femme fatale and the sexism within that character arc. And of course Rachel in this case is the femme fatale, or is she? That is the big question in this book, and you never really get to know, which is so interesting while reading, because you're like, wow, these men are so sexist. Then you think, wow, Rachel really is so manipulative. You have to actively keep on thinking while reading, and I read this for a book club and we had such interesting discussions about the book afterwards. So those were the many fiction novels I wanted to recommend to you. They are all amazing, so I would say pick one, pick two. I hope something has piqued your interest. For now, I'm sure I have overwhelmed you with a lot of recommendations, but thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a lovely day or evening, and I hope to see you in another video. Doei!